Hey, vinyl community and Beatles fans. Today I wanted to talk about the closest the Beatles ever came to recording what might be considered a novelty song. It's definitely the most interesting song that the Beatles ever recorded and what might be considered actually a comedy record. And I'm talking about You Know My Name, Look Up the Number. Now, this track appeared as the B-side of the Let It Be single, but it's got a very interesting etymology, which dates back to early 1967, as the Beatles were putting the finishing touches on the Sgt. Pepper album. So the story goes that John had arrived at Paul's house, was waiting for Paul to arrive. Apparently, he was out and hadn't come back yet, and John was sitting in Paul's living room and noticed that on the piano there was a phone book. And on the cover of the phone book there was the slogan, "You have their name, look up their number." So John thought that was a very interesting slogan and began sitting at the piano and just kind of trying to play around with that phrase and came up with a rhythm track. Now, when Paul arrived, John said, "Hey, I've got a new song." And he played it for Paul, and Paul said, "What are the lyrics?" And John said, "You know my name, look up the number." That's it. There's nothing else. The Beatles began recording the instrumental track for the first part of the song on May 17th, 1967, which was a few weeks before Sgt. Pepper would be released. There were 14 takes, with John on piano, Paul on bass, George on guitar, and Ringo on drums, and they also incorporated some bongos, tambourine, and hand claps. On June 7th, deciding that take 9 was the best, they added further overdubs and recorded an additional rhythm track that never ended up being used on the final version. The next day, on June 8th, they recorded parts 2 through 5 of the song. Present during the session was Rolling Stone Brian Jones, who contributed tenor saxophone. The only instance of one of the Rolling Stones performing an instrument on a Beatles record. George also added some vibraphone. On June 9th, the different parts were edited together and numbered take 30. At this stage, the song was 6 minutes and 8 seconds long. The Beatles abandoned this track to begin work on All You Need Is Love, and it would be 2 years before they would return to it. It was not until April 30th, 1969 that John and Paul resurrected the track, adding vocals, percussion, and sound effects, including Mal Evans, who I've done a video about, shoveling a bucket of gravel. Yes, in addition to being a world-class anvil player, he was also a top-notch gravel shoveler. During this session, wanting to create a nightclub feel for part 2 of the song, John asked the imaginary audience to applaud for Dennis O. Bell.
Good evening and welcome to Slaggers, featuring Dennis O. Bell.
This was a play on the name Dennis O'Dell, who was a film producer who had done work on A Hard Day's Night and Magical Mystery Tour, and he actually appears several times during the Get Back documentary. You've probably seen him. In November 1969, when it appeared the Beatles were not going to release the track, John prepared a test pressing of a single credited to the Plastic Ono Band, containing the White Album reject What's the New Mary Jane as the A-side, and You Know My Name, Look Up the Number as the B-side. In preparation for its release, John had edited the song down to 4 minutes and 19 seconds. The single was assigned a catalog number and a release date was announced in December. However, John withdrew plans for the single as the other Beatles opposed the idea on the grounds that the songs were both basically Beatles recordings. Eventually, the song saw release in May of 1970 as the B-side of the single Let It Be. Now, ironically, when the single came out, Dennis O'Dell actually began receiving late-night phone calls, and there were Beatles fans who actually arrived at his doorstep. They had looked up his address, and they just showed up there saying, "Hey, we're here to come live with you." Yeah, really. He was forced to have his name and his number withdrawn from the phone book and unlisted.